The summer heat of 1836 pressed down on Thornhill County like a suffocating hand, turning the red clay roads into dust and the air into something thick enough to taste. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed to burn with divine fury, their white bolls ready for harvest, but wilting under temperatures that hadn't broken below 90 degrees in 6 weeks. Slaves worked the rows in the brutal heat, their songs drifting across the land like prayers for rain that never came. In the heart of this scorched landscape stood Thornhill Chapel, a modest white structure with a bell tower that cast long shadows across the cemetery where 3 generations of God-fearing folk lay buried beneath weathered stones marked with simple crosses and fading names. The chapel had been built in 1789 by Scottish immigrants who'd claimed this land and made it yield crops through faith and backbreaking labor. Its white paint, applied fresh every spring, now peeled and blistered under the relentless sun, giving the building an aged, weary appearance that seemed to match the mood of the county itself. Elias Morland had served as deacon of Thornhill Chapel for 17 years, a position he'd inherited from his father and grandfather before him, men whose portraits hung in the chapel's small vestry room, their stern faces watching over every sermon, every prayer, every judgment rendered within those walls. At 53, he was a tall man, with shoulders that had once been broad but now curved inward, as if he were perpetually bracing against some invisible wind. His hands, which had once held his wife tenderly and lifted his daughter high into the air, now seemed to exist only for gripping his Bible or gesturing toward damnation. His eyes, once a clear blue that Rebecca had compared to Carolina skies in spring, had faded to the color of winter ice, and when he looked at you, it felt as though he was searching for something hidden deep within your soul, cataloguing your sins like entries in a ledger that would be opened on Judgment Day. People said the change had begun with Rebecca's illness, a wasting sickness that took her slowly over the course of a year, draining her beauty and vitality until she was barely recognizable in the final weeks. Elias had prayed constantly during that time, making bargains with God, promising greater devotion, more fervent faith, anything to save her. When she died despite his prayers, something fundamental had broken in him, and the crack had been widening ever since. The congregation of Thornhill Chapel numbered around 200 souls, mostly families who'd worked the same land for generations. They were simple people who measured their wealth in acres and children, who found comfort in the familiar rhythms of planting and harvest, birth and death, sin and redemption. They trusted Deacon Morland because their parents had trusted him, because he knew every family's secrets, because his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty when he spoke of heaven and hell. It was late July when Martha Whitfield first noticed the change in the deacon, though looking back later, she would realize there had been signs for weeks that she'd chosen to ignore. She'd come to the chapel on a Wednesday evening, as she did every week, to help clean the pews and arrange flowers for Sunday service. The air inside was still and hot, smelling of old wood and candle wax and something else, something acrid she couldn't quite identify. The sun was setting, painting the white walls orange and red through the tall windows, and she found Deacon Morland standing at the pulpit, his hands gripping the worn wood so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His coat was off, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and she could see he'd lost weight, his arms thin and corded with muscle and sinew. Papers were scattered across the pulpit, covered in writing so dense and frantic it looked like the work of a madman. Later, she would learn these were his sermon notes, pages and pages of scripture references, theological arguments, drawings of flames and crosses, and eyes that seemed to watch from every margin. "Deacon," Martha called softly, her voice echoing in the empty chapel. "Are you well?" He didn't turn immediately. When he finally looked at her, his face was drawn, his eyes carrying a feverish gleam that made her take an involuntary step backward. "The Lord has shown me a vision, Sister Martha," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire space. A vision of flames, purifying flames. We have grown complacent in our faith. We sit in these pews Sunday after Sunday, singing our hymns and reciting our prayers, but our hearts remain cold. The Lord demands more. He demands everything. Martha had known Elias Morland her entire life. She remembered him as a young man, full of passion for the gospel, but tempered with kindness. She remembered how he'd wept at her wedding, how he'd held her firstborn son at baptism, how he'd stood beside her grave when that same son was taken by fever at age 7. But the man before her now seemed like a stranger, wearing a familiar face. "We all grieve in our own ways, Deacon," she said gently, thinking of his wife Rebecca, who'd passed just 6 months earlier after a long illness. "The Lord understands our weaknesses." "Weakness," he repeated, the word coming out like a curse. "That's precisely the problem, Sister Martha. We've made peace with our weakness. We've convinced ourselves that God's mercy is a blanket we can hide beneath while continuing in our sins. But the Bible speaks of refinement through fire. Gold must be heated to impossible temperatures to burn away the impurities. How much more must we, as vessels of the divine, submit ourselves to God's purifying flame?" Martha felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. "I'll leave you to your prayers, Deacon," she said, backing toward the door. "I'll see you on Sunday." That Sunday, the chapel was packed as usual, with people arriving on foot, on horseback, and in wagons from farms spread across 10 miles. The heat was unbearable, made worse by the press of bodies in their Sunday finest. Wool and cotton that trapped the heat against skin already slick with perspiration. Women fanned themselves with folded paper, the sound like 1,000 whispers filling the chapel. Men loosened their collars when they thought no one was looking, their faces red and shining. Children fidgeted in the pews, counting the minutes until they could escape to the relative coolness of the shade trees outside, where they would spend the social hour playing tag and telling stories while their parents discussed crops and weather and the price of cotton in Charleston. The chapel smelled of sweat and perfume, of bodies packed too close together, of the flowers Martha had arranged that were already wilting in the heat. Outside, cicadas sang their high, buzzing song, the sound of summer itself given voice. Deacon Morland stood before them, his Bible open but untouched. He let the silence stretch until even the youngest child had stopped squirming, sensing something different in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost tender. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "I want you to close your eyes, all of you. Close your eyes and imagine you're standing before the throne of God. The book of your life is open before Him, every page filled with every thought, every word, every deed. Nothing hidden, nothing forgotten. How many of you can honestly say that book would be free of stains?" Around the chapel, heads bowed and eyes closed obediently, Deacon Morland walked down from the pulpit, his footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. He moved among the pews, his voice rising and falling like waves. "Now imagine the Lord shows you the flames of hell, not as some abstract concept, but as a real place, as real as this chapel, as real as the heat you feel right now pressing down on you. Imagine the temperature rising, your skin beginning to burn, your lungs filling with smoke, and you realize this is forever. No escape, no relief, no second chances." Sarah Jenkins, sitting in the third pew with her 3 daughters, felt her youngest begin to cry. She opened her eyes to comfort the child and found Deacon Morland standing directly beside her, his face inches from hers. She startled and he smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The fear you feel, Sister Sarah, is a gift. It's the beginning of wisdom. The Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But we've forgotten how to fear. We've made God into something comfortable, something manageable. We forget that He is a consuming fire." The service lasted 3 hours that day, twice its normal length. Deacon Morland preached about judgment and purification, about the narrow gate and the broad path, about the wheat and the tares. By the time he finally dismissed the congregation, people stumbled out into the sunlight like survivors of some ordeal, blinking and disoriented. Thomas Brennan, a wealthy landowner who donated the funds to repair the chapel's roof 5 years earlier, and who'd been a friend to Elias since they were boys fishing together in the creek that ran through both their properties, approached the deacon as people filed out. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from anger or fear he couldn't have said. "That was quite a sermon, Elias," he said carefully, aware that others were watching, measuring his words as a man might measure powder for a rifle, knowing too much or too little could prove disastrous. "Perhaps a bit intense for the children. I saw young Timothy Harris crying. His mother had to take him outside." Morland's ice-blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Thomas take a step back. "Tell me, Thomas, which concerns you more? That children might hear about the reality of hell, or that you might have to confront your own sins? You've built yourself a kingdom here in Thornhill County, fine house, prosperous fields, respect of your neighbors, but what does the Bible say? What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul?" "Nah, I've been a faithful member of this church for 40 years, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. "I've tithed faithfully, served on the council, helped my neighbors in times of need. I won't stand here and be lectured about my soul." "Won't you?" Morland stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps you should examine why my words make you so uncomfortable, Brother Thomas. The righteous have no need to defend themselves. Only the guilty bristle at truth." Thomas left without another word, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. But that night he gathered several other prominent members of the congregation at his home. They sat in his parlor, a room lined with books and maps of his properties, the windows open to catch any hint of breeze that might stir the heavy air. The men sat in leather chairs, worn soft with age, while the women perched on the settee, their skirts spread around them like wilted flowers. Thomas's wife, Rachel, moved among them with a silver pitcher, offering lemonade that was warm despite her best efforts to keep it cool. They sat in his parlor, the windows open to catch any hint of breeze, and voiced their concerns about the deacon's increasingly erratic behavior. The conversation was careful at first, everyone aware they were treading on sacred ground, questioning not just a man, but an institution, a legacy that stretched back generations. "He's not well," Martha Whitfield said, accepting a glass of lemonade from Thomas's wife. "The grief over Rebecca has unhinged him. Perhaps we should suggest he take some time away from his duties." "And who would replace him?" asked Jacob Miller, who owned the general store in town. "His family has led this church since before any of us were born. The congregation trusts him. If we move against him without cause, we'll tear the church apart." "Without cause?" Martha's voice rose. "Did you not hear him today? He spoke of nothing but fire and damnation for 3 hours. There was no mention of God's love, of grace, of redemption, only fear and judgment." "Perhaps that's what we need," said a quiet voice from the corner. Young William Harper, barely 21, sat with his hands clasped between his knees. "My pa used to say that this generation has grown soft. We live comfortable lives, and we've made God comfortable too. Maybe the deacon is right. Maybe we need to remember what we're being saved from." The older members of the group exchanged glances. The meeting ended without resolution, but a line had been drawn. Some saw Morland's transformation as a return to authentic faith, a necessary correction to years of comfortable Christianity. Others saw a man spiraling into dangerous fanaticism, using fear and manipulation to control a trusting congregation. Over the following weeks, the sermons grew longer and more intense. Morland began adding Wednesday evening services, then prayer meetings on Thursday mornings. He preached about the need for constant vigilance, for rooting out sin, not just in oneself, but in the community. He encouraged members to come forward and confess their transgressions publicly, to submit themselves to the judgment and correction of their brothers and sisters in Christ. The first to confess was Margaret Price, a young woman of 23 who stood before the congregation and, with tears streaming down her face, admitted she'd allowed a traveling salesman to kiss her behind the general store. Her mother wept in shame. Her father sat stone-faced. Deacon Moreland led the congregation in prayer for her soul, then assigned her a penance. She would clean the chapel every day for a month and would not be permitted to attend any social gatherings until her heart had been fully purified. Others followed. Men confessed to drinking, to gambling, to having impure thoughts. Women confessed to gossip, to vanity, to questioning their husband's authority. Children confessed to disobedience, to lying, to playing when they should have been praying. Each confession was met with more prayer, more penance, more scrutiny. The atmosphere in Thornhill County began to change in ways both subtle and profound. Neighbors who'd been friendly for years, who'd helped each other bring in harvests and sat vigil together through illnesses and celebrated baptisms and weddings together, now watched each other with suspicion. Samuel Porter stopped joining the men for their weekly card game at the general store, fearing someone would report him to the Deacon for gambling. Elizabeth Chen, who'd always worn pretty ribbons in her hair, began dressing in plain grey and black, terrified of being accused of vanity. Children who'd once played freely in the streets now moved in hushed groups, glancing over their shoulders, their laughter muted. Any laugh seemed too loud, any pleasure seemed suspicious, any moment not devoted to prayer or work seemed like an invitation to sin. The church, which had once been the warm heart of the community, where marriages were arranged and business deals were sealed and friendships were forged, became something else entirely, a place of judgment and fear, where every word was weighed, every glance interpreted, every silence suspected of hiding sin. It was early September when Moreland announced his new vision. Standing before them like a prophet descended from some Old Testament mountain. The heat had broken slightly, temperatures dropping into the 80s, but the chapel was still stifling, the air heavy with humidity that made everything feel damp and close when he stood before the congregation, his face gaunt from fasting that had left his cheekbones sharp and prominent, his eyes burning with fervent intensity that seemed to come from some internal fire that was consuming him from within. He'd been fasting for 3 days, drinking only water, and his voice had taken on a strange, hollow quality that made it seem to come from somewhere far away. "The Lord has revealed to me the depth of our corruption," he announced. "We have been playing at Christianity, brothers and sisters. We have been pretending at faith, but God sees through our performance. He sees the rot at the core of this community, and He demands cleansing." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. "From now on, when we gather for worship, the doors of this chapel will be locked, not to keep the world out, but to keep us in. We will remain in prayer and meditation until God releases us. We will fast. We will confess. We will submit ourselves completely to His purifying work. Only when our hearts are truly changed will we be permitted to leave." Martha Whitfield stood up, something almost unheard of during a sermon. "Deacon Moreland, with all respect, that's not right. We have children here. We have elderly folk. We have crops to tend and livestock to care for. We cannot simply lock ourselves away." The deacon's face remained calm, but his voice carried an edge, sharp as broken glass. "And that, Sister Martha, is precisely the problem. We always have excuses. We always have reasons why we cannot fully surrender to God. The world and its concerns always come before our eternal souls. But the Bible is clear. No man, having put his hand to the plough and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. This isn't about commitment to God, Thomas Brennan said, standing beside Martha. This is about control. You're not a shepherd leading a flock, Elias. You're becoming a jailer. The word hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment, Moreland said nothing. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing anyone in that chapel had ever seen. A jailer, he repeated softly. Perhaps. But consider this, Brother Thomas. When a man is drowning, when the current is pulling him down into the depths, sometimes the only way to save him is to hold him under the water until he stops fighting, until he surrenders completely. Only then can you pull him to safety. I'm trying to save your souls, even if you fight me, especially if you fight me. The service ended in confusion and argument. About half the congregation left immediately, vowing never to return as long as Moreland remained deacon. The other half stayed, some out of genuine belief in the deacon's vision, others out of fear of being seen as disloyal to God if they left. That night, Thomas Brennan rode to the county seat to speak with the sheriff. He found Sheriff James Hawthorne in his office, feet up on his desk, smoking a pipe in the lamplight. "Sheriff, we have a problem in Thornhill," Thomas began, and proceeded to lay out everything that had been happening at the chapel. Hawthorne listened quietly, occasionally asking questions. When Thomas finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "Now, Tom," he finally said, "I hear what you're saying, and I understand your concern. But here's the thing, a man preaching hellfire and brimstone, even if he's preaching it louder than most folk are comfortable with, that's not against the law. Locking the church doors during service, well, I've heard of churches that do that to avoid interruptions. It's unusual, sure, but not illegal. James, this isn't about legality. It's about safety. The man is becoming unhinged. I'm genuinely worried about what he might do. Has he threatened anyone? Has he done anything violent?" "No, but—" "Then my hands are tied, Tom. This is a church matter, not a law matter. You need to handle this within your congregation. Talk to the church council. Vote him out if that's what you want, but I can't go arresting a man for preaching too hard." Thomas left frustrated but unsurprised. In 1836, South Carolina, the line between church and state was blurry at best, and few lawmen wanted to be seen interfering in matters of faith. He would have to find another way. The first locked-door service happened on the last Sunday of September, on a morning when the sky was the color of old bruises, purple and gray, threatening rain that never came. About 80 people showed up, a significant drop from the usual attendance of nearly 200. Many families had chosen to stay home or to join those gathering in Thomas Brennan's barn for alternative services led by traveling preachers from neighboring counties. As they filed in, stepping from bright morning light into the dim interior, they noticed the deacon had made changes to the chapel that sent cold fear trickling down their spines, despite the heat. He'd nailed heavy boards across the windows, leaving only small gaps near the ceiling for ventilation. Gaps perhaps 6 inches wide that let in thin shafts of light, but would be useless for escape. The effect was claustrophobic, transforming the familiar space into something that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. He'd installed new, heavy locks on both the front and side doors, professional locks purchased from Charleston, the kind used on jails and banks, with keys that hung from his belt on a chain. And he'd arranged braziers at the front of the chapel, 3 of them standing in a row like pagan altars, filled with coal that glowed red in the dim light, radiating heat that turned the already warm chapel into something like an oven. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," Moreland said as the last person entered. "Today begins our true journey towards salvation." He walked to the front doors and, with deliberate slowness, turned the key in the lock. The metallic click seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Then he moved to the side door and did the same. When he turned back to face the congregation, several people had stood up. "Deacon, you can't seriously intend to lock us in," James Cotton said, a tremor in his voice. "Sit down, Brother James. We are here to worship, not to debate. If your faith is strong, you have nothing to fear." "This is madness," someone called out. Others murmured agreement, but no one made a move toward the doors. The weight of social pressure, of religious authority, of not wanting to be the one who caused a scene, kept them in their seats. Moreland began to preach. The braziers heated the already warm chapel, and sweat soon dripped from every face. The deacon spoke of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of Job's faithfulness through suffering, of the early Christian martyrs who'd been burned alive rather than renounce their faith. He spoke for hours, his voice rising and falling, building to crescendos that left him gasping and then falling to whispers that forced everyone to lean forward to hear. Children began to cry from heat and thirst. Women fanned themselves desperately. Men loosened their collars and rolled up their sleeves. The air grew thick and close, heavy with the smell of sweat and burning coal. "Let us out," a voice finally shouted. It was Sarah Jenkins, holding her youngest daughter who'd gone limp from the heat. "My child is ill. She needs air and water." Moreland stopped mid-sentence and turned to look at her. "Your child needs salvation, Sister Sarah. We all do. The discomfort you feel is nothing compared to the fires of hell. This is a lesson in what awaits those who are not truly committed to God." "You're a madman." Sarah stood, cradling her daughter. "Someone stop him. Break down the door if you have to." Several men moved toward the front, but Moreland pulled something from beneath the pulpit, a long hunting knife that gleamed in the red light from the braziers. He didn't point it at anyone, just held it loosely in his hand. "The first person who touches those doors before I give permission," he said quietly, "will answer to God for their lack of faith. We are staying until the Lord releases us, until every soul in this chapel has truly repented and truly surrendered." The men stopped, uncertain. Violence in a house of God against a man they'd known and respected for years, it seemed unthinkable. They looked at each other, at the locked doors, at the deacon with his knife, and no one knew what to do. It was William Harper who finally broke the stalemate. The young man who'd defended the deacon weeks earlier now stood up, his face pale but determined. "This isn't faith, Deacon. This is fear and control. You're using God's name to imprison us, and I won't be part of it anymore." He walked toward the front door, ignoring the knife, ignoring Moreland's commands to stop. When he reached the door, he grabbed the heavy lock and pulled. It held firm. He threw his shoulder against the door, once, twice, 3 times. The wood began to splinter. Other men joined him. Together they rammed the door until the lock finally gave way with a crack that echoed through the chapel. People rushed for the opening, pushing and shoving in their desperation for fresh air and freedom. Sarah Jenkins was carried out with her daughter. Martha Whitfield stumbled into the sunlight and fell to her knees, gasping. Deacon Moreland watched them go, standing motionless at the front of the chapel, the knife still in his hand. When the last person had fled, he looked at the broken door, at the empty pews, at the braziers still glowing red. Then he smiled. News of what had happened spread quickly through Thornhill County, carried by riders on horseback and by slaves sent between plantations with messages, growing and changing with each telling until some versions barely resembled the truth. The next day, a meeting was called at Thomas Brennan's home, attended by everyone who'd been at the chapel, plus many who hadn't, but who felt they had a stake in what happened to their community's spiritual center. People arrived throughout the afternoon, some on horseback, others in wagons, a few on foot, all wearing expressions of anger or fear or confusion. They gathered not just in the parlor, but spilling out onto the porch and into the yard, over 60 people standing in the late afternoon heat, united by their fear of what Elias Moreland had become. The consensus was clear. Elias Morland had to be removed from his position as deacon. Voices rose and fell in waves of anger and anguish. People who'd never spoken harshly of anyone now calling for immediate action, for consequences, for protection of their families and their community. But there was a problem. The church charter, written by Morland's grandfather 70 years earlier, gave the deacon nearly absolute authority. He could only be removed by a unanimous vote of the church council, and 2 of the 5 council members had not been present at the locked-door service. They refused to vote against Morland, insisting the whole thing had been exaggerated, that people had panicked over nothing. "He held us prisoner," Martha Whitfield said, her voice shaking. "He threatened us with a knife." "He held a knife, yes," replied council member David Walsh. "But he didn't threaten anyone with it. He was protecting the sanctity of the service from those who would interrupt it with their lack of faith." The meeting dissolved into angry arguments. The community that had been united for generations was now fractured, torn between those who saw Morland as a dangerous fanatic and those who saw him as a prophet, calling them back to true faith. Through it all, Elias Morland remained in the chapel. People passing by would see lamplight in the windows late into the night. Sometimes they'd hear him singing hymns in a cracked, fervent voice. Sometimes they'd hear him weeping, and sometimes, most disturbing of all, they'd hear him laughing. October brought cooler weather but no relief from the tension in Thornhill County. Those who'd left the church began holding services in Thomas Brennan's barn. Those who remained loyal to Morland continued to attend the chapel, though attendance had dwindled to perhaps 20 faithful souls. Among those who still came was Anna Morland, the deacon's 19-year-old daughter. She'd always been a quiet girl, overshadowed by her father's intensity and her mother's recent death. But in the weeks following the locked door incident, she began to change. She started speaking during services, her voice soft but carrying a strange certainty. She claimed God was giving her visions, showing her the future of Thornhill Chapel. "I see flames," she told the remaining congregation one evening. "Purifying flames that will cleanse this place and everyone in it. We will be refined like gold in fire, and we will emerge as pure vessels for God's glory." Her father beamed with pride. Here, at last, was confirmation that his vision was God's will. If his own daughter, innocent and pure, was seeing the same things, then how could anyone doubt? Martha Whitfield's daughter, Elizabeth, was Anna's best friend. They'd grown up together, shared secrets and dreams, planned their futures side by side. Elizabeth was among those who'd stopped attending Thornhill Chapel, but she couldn't abandon her friend. One evening in late October, she snuck away from her family and went to the chapel. She found Anna alone, kneeling at the altar, her lips moving in silent prayer. The braziers, which had never been removed after the locked-door service, cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Anna," Elizabeth whispered, sliding into the pew beside her friend. "Anna, what's happened to you?" Anna turned and Elizabeth gasped. Her friend's face was gaunt, her eyes fever-bright, her skin pale as chalk. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. "Elizabeth," Anna said, and her voice was dreamy, distant. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "What do you mean?" "Anna, you need help. You need to leave this place. Come home with me. My mother would take you in. You don't have to stay here with your father." "My father is doing God's work," Anna replied, but there was something hollow in her voice, as if she were reciting words she'd been taught rather than speaking her own thoughts. "We're preparing for the final service. The one that will change everything." "What final service?" "The one where we pass through the flames. Father says it's the only way to know who's truly faithful and who's not. Those with genuine faith will be protected. Those without will be revealed." Elizabeth grabbed her friend's hands. They were cold, despite the heat from the braziers. Anna, listen to yourself. That's not God talking. That's not even your father talking. That's madness. Your father has gone mad with grief, and he's taking you with him." For a moment, something flickered in Anna's eyes, some recognition of truth. But then she pulled her hands away. "You don't understand. You can't understand unless you've surrendered everything. But you still cling to the world, to comfort, to safety. That's why you left. That's why you're not ready." Ready for what? For what comes next? Elizabeth left the chapel with a sense of dread so heavy it made her stomach hurt. She went straight to Thomas Brennan's house and told him everything Anna had said. By midnight, a dozen men were gathered in Brennan's parlor, trying to decide what to do. "We have to go to the sheriff again," Martha Whitfield insisted. "Anna's testimony proves he's planning something dangerous." "The sheriff won't do anything based on the ravings of a grief-stricken girl," Thomas replied. "We need proof of actual criminal intent." "How much more proof do you need?" Elizabeth cried. "He's talking about passing through flames. He's convinced my best friend that burning is the path to salvation. What do you think he's planning?" James Cotton, who'd been one of the first to escape the locked door service, spoke up. "I say we confront him, all of us together. We go to the chapel, we tell him he's done as deacon, and we physically remove him if necessary." "That could turn violent," someone warned. "It's already violent," Cotton replied. "We're just the ones refusing to see it." The next Sunday, they made their move. About 40 people, those who'd left the chapel and some who'd never attended at all but were concerned citizens of Thornhill County, marched to the white building with its bell tower. They found the doors locked, but they could hear voices inside, singing a hymn. Thomas Brennan pounded on the door. "Elias, Elias Morland, we need to speak with you." The singing stopped. Footsteps approached the door, but it didn't open. Morland's voice came through the wood, calm and measured. "Whatever you have to say can wait until after service, Brother Thomas." "No, it can't. We're here to inform you that you are no longer deacon of this church. The congregation has spoken. We want you to gather your belongings and leave peacefully." There was a long silence. Then Morland laughed, a sound so devoid of humor it made several people step back from the door. "The congregation has spoken. I see about 40 people out there, Thomas. Do you know how many are in here with me? 27. Faithful souls who haven't abandoned their commitment to God because things got uncomfortable. You have no authority here. You forfeited that when you ran away. We didn't run away. We escaped. You held us prisoner." "I held you accountable. There's a difference." "Elias, please," Martha Whitfield called out. "My daughter says Anna is unwell. Let us take her to a doctor. You can stay if you insist, but let the others go. Let your own daughter go." "My daughter is exactly where she needs to be, Sister Martha. She understands what you cannot, that faith requires sacrifice, that salvation requires suffering, that we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven with our hands clutching the things of this world." William Harper stepped forward. "Then prove your faith, Deacon. Open the door. Face us without the safety of locked doors and your little band of followers. If God is truly on your side, you have nothing to fear from us." Another long silence. Then, "Next Sunday, November 15th, we will hold our final service. All are welcome to attend. All who wish to prove their faith, to truly surrender to God's refining fire, I invite you to join us. But understand this, there will be no leaving early, no running away when things become difficult. We will see it through to the end, whatever that end may be. The doors will be locked, and they will not open until God Himself releases us." "You're insane," someone shouted. "No," Morland replied, his voice carrying a terrible certainty. "I'm the only sane person in Thornhill County. The rest of you are sleepwalking toward damnation, and you're angry at me for trying to wake you up." The group outside debated breaking down the door right then, but Sheriff Hawthorne, who'd been summoned from town, arrived and advised against it. You force your way in? Someone's likely to get hurt or killed, he said. And legally, those folks in there are there of their own free will. If they want to be in a locked church with a crazy preacher, that's their right. What about Anna? Elizabeth demanded. She's just 19, she's not thinking clearly. She's of legal age. Unless you can prove she's being held against her will, there's nothing I can do. Right, so we just wait? Thomas asked incredulously. We wait until November 15th and hope he doesn't do something insane? I'll be here that day, the sheriff promised. If he tries to lock anyone in, I'll stop him. But until then, my hands are tied. The week leading up to November 15th was one of the strangest in Thornhill County's history. The weather turned unseasonably cold, and a thick fog rolled in from the coast, blanketing the landscape in grey. The air felt heavy, expectant, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Those still loyal to moorland moved into the chapel, sleeping on the pews, taking their meals together, spending their days in prayer and fasting. They sang hymns that drifted out into the fog, voices thin and ghostly. They could be seen through the gaps in the boarded windows, shapes moving in lamplight, shadows without substance. The rest of Thornhill County tried to go about their normal business, but normal had become impossible. Everyone was waiting, watching the chapel, wondering what would happen when November 15th arrived. Elizabeth tried multiple times to see Anna, walking to the chapel at different hours, sometimes in the heat of midday, when she thought everyone might be resting, sometimes at dawn, when the world was still cool and quiet, sometimes after dark, when she could approach unseen. But the chapel doors remained locked, solid and unyielding as stone. She stood outside and called her friend's name, her voice echoing off the white walls, begging her to come out, promising safety, offering love and shelter, and a chance to escape whatever madness had consumed that place. Sometimes she thought she saw Anna's face at one of the high windows, pale and drawn, lips moving as if trying to form words. But whether it was really her, or just a trick of lamplight and fog and desperate hope, she couldn't be sure. Once, she saw what might have been a hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed as if reaching for help. But then it was gone, and she was left standing in the damp grass, tears mixing with the fog on her face, feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. She brought food and left it by the door, wrapped in cloth, hoping Anna might find it, but it always remained untouched. And after the third day, animals had gotten to it, leaving nothing but scattered crumbs and torn fabric. Thomas Brennan spent the week trying to find legal means to intervene. He contacted a judge in Charleston, wrote letters to the bishop, even sent a telegram to the governor. The responses were all variations of the same message. This was a church matter, and unless actual crimes were committed, the law could not interfere. On the morning of November 15, 1836, the fog was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, a white blanket that swallowed the world and muffled all sound, until it felt like being underwater, like being suspended in some liminal space between the living world and whatever lay beyond. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, unusual for South Carolina even in November, and people's breath came out in visible puffs that were quickly swallowed by the fog. Ice had formed on standing water, thin sheets that cracked underfoot, and the grass was stiff with frost that crunched when walked upon. Thornhill Chapel emerged from the mist like a ghost ship sailing through clouds, its white walls grey in the dim light, indistinct and wavering as if not quite solid, its bell tower disappearing into the fog above so that it seemed to reach up into infinity. The building looked smaller somehow, huddled and menacing, and more than one person crossing the field toward it felt an instinctive desire to turn back, to flee as if the chapel itself was warning them away. By 10 o'clock a crowd had gathered outside. Sheriff Hawthorne was there with 2 deputies. Thomas Brennan, Martha Whitfield, Elizabeth and dozens of others stood shivering in the cold, waiting to see what would happen. At exactly 11 o'clock, The chapel doors opened. Deacon Morland stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight from inside. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past weeks. His hair had gone completely white. His face was skeletal. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, but his eyes, those ice-blue eyes, burned with undiminished fervor. "Welcome," he said simply, and stepped aside. People looked at each other, uncertain. No one wanted to enter, but the open door seemed to demand a response. "Anyone who enters," Sheriff Hawthorne called out, "enters of their own free will. Deacon, you're not planning to lock anyone in, are you?" "I plan to conduct a service," Morland replied. "What happens after that is in God's hands." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have, Sheriff." Martha Whitfield stepped forward. "I'm going in," she announced. "My God, those people have been in there for a week. Someone needs to see that they're all right." "I'm coming with you," Elizabeth said. Several others joined them, including William Harper and James Cotton. Sheriff Hawthorne positioned his deputies at the door. "I'm staying right here," he told Morland. "If you try to lock that door with people inside, you'll answer to me." Morland simply smiled and walked back into the chapel. Inside, the transformation was shocking in ways that went beyond mere physical changes to the space. The pews had been rearranged into a circle facing inward, creating an arena-like configuration that made everyone visible to everyone else, eliminating any possibility of hiding or escape into anonymous observation. In the center of the circle sat a massive brazier, easily 6 feet across, constructed from what appeared to be the chapel's iron gate and other scrap metal, welded and wired together into a crude but functional furnace. It was filled with coals that glowed red-hot, pulsing like a living heart, radiating heat that turned the already close air into something suffocating and oppressive. The temperature inside must have been over 100 degrees, despite the freezing temperatures outside. The heat was intense, making the already close air feel suffocating, making it hard to breathe, making sweat pour down faces and soak through clothing within moments of entering. The boarded windows trapped the heat and smoke, creating an atmosphere that was thick and hazy. Visibility reduced to perhaps 20 feet. Everything beyond that lost in dancing shadows and wavering heat. It was like standing at the mouth of hell itself, and several people who entered immediately turned to leave, only to find their way blocked by others pressing in behind them. The 27 faithful, who'd been living in the chapel, sat in the circled pews, their faces turned toward the brazier. They looked like prisoners or asylum inmates, pale and gaunt from fasting, eyes glazed with something that might have been devotion or might have been simple exhaustion. Among them, Elizabeth spotted Anna, sitting between her father and an elderly woman named Ruth Pierce. "Anna!" Elizabeth called out, but her friend didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. Morland walked to the center, standing beside the massive brazier. The heat made his face shimmer and waver, as if he were already passing into some other realm. He raised his hands, and everyone fell silent. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the hushed space, "we have come to the end of our journey. For weeks we have prayed together, fasted together, searched our hearts together. We have confessed our sins and surrendered our wills. We have prepared ourselves for this moment." Martha grabbed Elizabeth's arm. "We need to get these people out of here," she whispered urgently. But before they could move, Morland continued, his voice rising. "The Bible tells us that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Today we will prove our faith. Today we will walk through the fire, and those who truly believe will emerge unharmed, purified, cleansed of all sin. Those who doubt will be revealed, and they will face God's judgment." "You're talking about walking into that fire?" James Cotton said incredulously. "You'll be burned alive." "Only if my faith is insufficient," Morland replied calmly. "But I believe. I know that God will protect me, just as he protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And I know that those who join me, who truly believe, will also be protected." "This is murder," Martha said, her voice shaking. "You're planning to kill these people and call it faith. I'm planning to give them a choice, faith or fear, heaven or hell. That's all life comes down to in the end, Sister Martha." He turned to his followers. "Who among you will take the first step with me? Who among you has faith enough to walk into the flames?" No one moved. The heat from the brazier was so intense that even sitting several feet away was almost unbearable. The idea of walking into it was incomprehensible. "Father," Anna said, and her voice was small, frightened, nothing like the fervent certainty she'd been displaying. "Father, I'm scared." "Faith casts out fear, daughter. You must believe." "I want to believe. I do believe, but I'm so scared." Moreland's face softened for just a moment, and in that moment, those watching saw a glimpse of the man he'd once been, the loving father, the compassionate shepherd. But then his jaw tightened, and the moment passed. "Then your faith is not yet strong enough. We will pray together until it is." He began to pray, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic chant. His followers joined in, some confidently, others with voices that trembled. The heat continued to build, the smoke grew thicker, and the people who'd come in from outside began to feel dizzy and disoriented. "I'm getting them out," Sheriff Hawthorne said, appearing in the doorway. "This is too dangerous. Everyone not part of this insanity needs to leave now." Martha, Elizabeth, and the others moved toward the door, but Elizabeth broke away and ran to Anna. She grabbed her friend's hand and pulled. "Come with me, please. You don't have to prove anything. Just come with me." Anna looked at her, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. Don't you see? If I leave now, it means I never believed. It means everything we did, everything Mother went through, it was all for nothing. Your mother died of illness, Anna, not because of faith or lack of it. She died because sometimes people just die, but you don't have to. You can choose to live. Choose life, Anna, please." For a moment, Anna wavered. Her hand tightened around Elizabeth's. But then her father's voice cut through the haze. "Let her go, Elizabeth. You're trying to steal her soul to comfort your own weakness. Get out of my church." "It's not your church anymore," Elizabeth said, but she released Anna's hand. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." She stumbled toward the door, coughing from the smoke. Sheriff Hawthorne caught her as she emerged into the cold, foggy air. "We have to do something," Elizabeth gasped. "He's going to kill them all." "I can't arrest a man for conducting a church service," Hawthorne said, but he looked troubled. "Even an insane one." "Then we'll burn," came Moreland's voice from inside the chapel, "because that door is about to be locked, and it will stay locked until God releases us." He appeared in the doorway, holding something in his hand. In the grey light, it took a moment to recognize it as a padlock, new and heavy. "You can't," Hawthorne said, but even as he spoke, Moreland was swinging the door closed. "God's will be done," the deacon said, and the door slammed shut. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then Hawthorne and his deputies threw themselves against the door, but Moreland had secured it from inside with multiple locks and heavy boards. Through the gaps, they could hear him still praying, his voice now ecstatic, triumphant. "Break it down!" Thomas Brennan shouted, and men ran to get axes and crowbars from nearby houses. But it was too late. Someone inside had knocked over one of the many braziers, or perhaps they'd done it deliberately, accepting the fire as their final test of faith. Whatever the cause, flames began to spread across the wooden floor, climbing the walls, devouring the old, dry timber of the pews. The screaming started almost immediately. Not prayers now, not hymns, but raw terror as people realized what was happening. They threw themselves against the doors and boarded windows, their fists pounding, their voices begging for help. Thomas and the others worked frantically with axes, trying to break through the doors or walls, but the flames spread faster than they could work. The heat drove them back. The smoke grew so thick it was impossible to see, and still the screaming continued, rising to a crescendo that would haunt the nightmares of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Inside, through a gap in the boards, Elizabeth caught one last glimpse of Anna. She was standing near her father, flames all around them, and she was looking directly at Elizabeth. Her lips moved, forming words. "I'm sorry." Then the roof collapsed, sending a column of sparks and smoke into the fog-choked sky. The screaming stopped. 27 people died in the fire at Thornhill Chapel that day. Deacon Elias Moreland, his daughter Anna, and 25 others who'd believed his promises of divine protection. When the ashes finally cooled enough to search, they found the bodies clustered near the doors and windows. Their final moments spent trying to escape the purifying flames their faith had promised would not harm them. The investigation was brief. The official report stated that Deacon Moreland, in a state of religious mania brought on by grief and possibly mental illness, had orchestrated a mass murder-suicide, locking his followers in the chapel and deliberately setting it ablaze. No criminal charges were filed, as the primary perpetrator was among the dead. But that official explanation satisfied no one. How could a madman maintain such control over rational adults? How could educated, sensible people be convinced to willingly enter a death trap? The questions had no good answers. And Thornhill County was left to wrestle with the reality that their trusted spiritual leader had led dozens of their neighbors to horrific deaths. The ruins of Thornhill Chapel stood for several months, a blackened skeleton against the South Carolina landscape, before Thomas Brennan paid to have them removed and the ground plowed under. No marker was placed, no memorial erected. The community wanted only to forget, to move past the nightmare that had consumed them. But forgetting proved impossible. The families of the dead bore the weight of unanswered questions. Could they have done more? Should they have intervened sooner? Martha Whitfield blamed herself for not being more forceful in opposing Moreland. Elizabeth never forgave herself for leaving Anna behind. Thomas Brennan became obsessed with the question of religious authority, eventually writing a series of essays on the danger of giving any individual unchecked power over a congregation. Sheriff Hawthorne gave up his position months later, unable to live with the memory of standing outside while people burned to death just feet away. He moved west, looking for somewhere the fog didn't remind him of that November day. Those who'd been at the locked-door service in September, who'd experienced Moreland's fanaticism firsthand but escaped, were forever marked by the knowledge that they'd been minutes away from being trapped in that final inferno. They became zealous advocates for church transparency, for accountability, for the importance of questioning authority, even when that authority claimed to speak for God. The story of Thornhill Chapel spread throughout South Carolina and beyond. It was told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith, about the importance of critical thinking even in matters of religion, about the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable members from charismatic leaders who might exploit them. But the deepest impact was felt by the survivors of Thornhill County itself, who had to live with the knowledge that they'd watched their neighbors, their friends, their family members walk willingly into death, believing until the very end that their faith would save them. They'd seen how easily fear could be weaponized, how quickly community bonds could be twisted into instruments of control, how the language of salvation could become the language of destruction. The lesson they learned, paid for in blood and ash and 27 lives lost, was that freedom, true freedom, requires vigilance. It requires the courage to question, to dissent, to resist, even when resistance means standing against someone who claims divine authority. It requires remembering that any faith worth having must be freely chosen, freely practiced, and freely abandoned if it leads toward darkness rather than light. In the years that followed, a new Thornhill chapel was built on different ground, with wide doors that could never be locked from inside, with windows that could be easily opened, with a charter that distributed authority among many, rather than concentrating it in one. And above the entrance, carved into the stone, were words that captured everything the community had learned at such terrible cost. Test all things, hold fast what is good. Because that, in the end, was what the flames of Thornhill Chapel had taught them. That freedom isn't just about the absence of physical chains. It's about maintaining the mental and spiritual independence to recognize a prison, even when it's built with prayers and locked with scripture. It's about refusing to surrender your judgment, your conscience, your very humanity, no matter how persuasive the person demanding that surrender might be. The people of Thornhill County carried those lessons forward, told the story to their children and grandchildren, ensured that the 27 who died would not be forgotten, and their deaths would not be meaningless. They created, from ashes and grief and hard-won wisdom, a legacy of resistance to tyranny in all its forms, spiritual or otherwise. And they never stopped asking the questions that mattered. Who holds power? How is that power used? And most importantly, what happens to those who dare to say no? Those questions, born in the flames of a South Carolina chapel in 1836, echo still. A reminder that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility, not a state of being, but an eternal struggle. Not something achieved once and kept forever, but something that must be defended and protected and fought for in every generation by every person who understands that the alternative to freedom is not just chains and locked doors, but the burning destruction of everything that makes us human.